Well, it's been a big week for China-EU relations. Now, bear in mind the result of that relationship could have far-reaching consequences for global trade, Africa included, and the balance of geopolitical power among continents. So, what discussions exactly are ongoing between China and European countries? Let's go to Berlin now for more on China's efforts to gain more access to overseas markets. William Glowcroft is correspondent with our partners, the DW. Now, William, it's good to have you once again. I trust that you're doing okay. Now, Chinese President Xi Jinping has had a couple of meetings with our president, Nana Akufo-Addo, and we understand that he's coming to meet with the EU leaders. Tell us a bit more about this meeting.
Right, it's good to be here. Yes, Chinese President Xi Jinping went to Europe as a kind of public relations tour, but also to do business. He stopped in France for a big meeting with French President Emmanuel Macron. There, the two of them signed as many as 15 business deals, including a $40 billion contract for as many as 300 commercial planes from Airbus. Airbus being, of course, the French-led European aerospace consortium. That's a huge contract on level with China's contracts with Boeing, the U.S. manufacturer and competitor of Airbus. So some major business deals going on, but Macron wanted to expand horizons, expand the discussion beyond just a bilateral level between China and France. And so he invited Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel and the European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker to Paris for discussions. It was a rather unprecedented move to go from a bilateral to a multilateral situation. He wanted the four of them to discuss what exactly EU and China relations are going to be going forward. The EU has been criticized, especially in the US, but also within Europe, for being too soft and too naive when it comes to China. The EU seems to be responding to this by putting forward this month, just shortly before Xi Jinping came to Europe, a so-called 10-point plan, which is to sort of reinvigorate and refocus European relations with China based around the United Nations, peace, security, development, labor standards, environment standards, climate change goals, these sorts of things, and not just about price and business. So those are the kinds of the conversations going on in Paris this week between the Chinese president, the French president, the German chancellor, and the European Commission president.
Well, certainly America's relations with China will never be described as, America will never be described as naive as perhaps some of these other EU leaders have been described as. But here in Ghana, when China has come here, their focus has largely been on natural resources. Do we know how the country's meeting with the EU connect with its long-term infrastructure and trade projects?
Well, that is a big question here this week, because shortly before Xi Jinping came to Europe, in fact, one of his reasons for coming was to go to Italy, and Italy became the first G7 country and a founding member of the European Union to join China's so-called Belt and Road Initiative, which is something that so far many smaller nations in Asia and Africa have become part of. It's a major multi-year global infrastructure project that China is pushing very hard, an infrastructure and trade project that could cost up to $1 trillion. That is basically in exchange for funding for infrastructure money. China gets control of ports, of infrastructure, of resources, as you mentioned as an example in Ghana. Now, Italy has signed a non-binding agreement with China to also take part in this kind of deal. That has China applauding Italy for taking part in what China sees as a way of making global trade faster and more efficient, but has critics worried that it might make Italy financially dependent on China and might give up too much of Italy's infrastructure and too much of Italy's resources to China, and thereby giving China direct access to European markets and more of an unfair competition within European markets, which is something European leaders criticize the Chinese-European relationship for lacking, that it's not a fair, level playing field. So this is something that is right at the forefront of conversations among European leaders that is shaping Chinese-EU relations going forward.
That's interesting. And in the midst of all of these, what might China and the EU's next move be like?
Well, we're looking ahead to April 9th, when there's going to be a major EU-China summit in Brussels. Many of these kinds of topics of fairness, competition, climate change, global security, development. All these issues are coming to the fore again on April 9th. This 10-point plan that I mentioned that the European Commission put forward to reinvigorate and redefine Chinese relations with the European Union is something that its member states, the EU member states, want to revise, comment on, change, and that would allow over the next year or two, the European Union hopes to develop a more concrete and lasting strategy with its eyes open, as it likes to say, towards China. China, however, let's not forget, remains the EU's major trading partner alongside the United States. So it's certainly not going away, and the importance of business deals between the European Union and China is also certainly not going away.
Well, it'll be interesting to know how this goes. Hopefully, African leaders will be able to pick up a clue or two as to how they shape their own relationship with this emerging superpower. William, thank you very much for that update. William Glucroft is correspondent with our partners, the DW. He joined me all the way from Berlin with our usual crossover, getting to know what's happening in the EU and, of course, how it relates to us here in Ghana and in Africa. This is still The Pulse with me, Gifty and Doapia.